King of the Nile, the Rise of Arrakkamani. Part 1. The Ethiopian Master. This is the story of a man named Arrakkamani, King Arrakkamani to be precise. But then again, in the merciless desert, a man may claim to be king of all he sees and still perish before he finds another soul to rule over. That is not to say Arrakkamani was a petty king. He ruled the ancient land of Kush, the source of the mighty Nile, a land that in ages past had given birth to men of his own blood who were called Pharaoh. This last fact lay squarely in the king's attention, day and night, year after year. He read the records of his forebears, learned their ways of war, their ways of politics, and learned that they had found courage to take that which they wanted from the plates held out by the gods. He reasoned that he could well do the same, and his reasoning was clear and crisp as the river his people hung their civilization across. A king from source to sea, from desert to snow, from now until the end of time. Was it the dream of a mere child? If so, then you must concede that in the year 278 BC, such a child mustered an army of thousands of skilled hunters, brave warriors and loyal subjects to the lords of Medewi, his capital city. They made a pilgrimage through the desert to find Arrakkamani's camp, positioned on the road to the neighbouring kingdom of Axum. Axum had always been rich in gold, and in more recent times they had found themselves rich in the luxuries summoned from beyond the eastern seas, stood on the edge of the known world. Everything Arrakkamani wanted was in the other direction, but to convince men to leave the lush valleys of Medewi for the great unknown, he would need coin, beasts, and a shield on his back. Axum longed for Medewi, the greatest city in Ethiopia, awash with lumber, minerals and labour as it was, an oasis in a barren land, and their swords and spears had been drawn long ago. To save his people and to found his legacy, Arrakkamani marched 4,000 to war. And as they marched, the lords of Axum squinted through the autumn haze flowing from the distant sands up into the heavens. At first it looked like 100. The Medewi got closer. It looked more like 500 now. They got closer still. The image of that army, shaken violently by the heat, grew larger and larger in the eyes of Axum, and all who fled the roads at their advance spoke of the ground shaking, of an army that stretched from horizon to a spear's length from your eyes, speaking so passionately and at length that they forgot to mention the precious stones that had dappled their fingers under the warm smile of the invaders. And so, in the final days of the advance, it seemed to the lords of Axum that all the world was under arms, the work of the gods and nothing less. When Arrakkamani arrived, the armies that a mountain of gold could buy were gone. Axum was his, the work of the gods indeed. It took weeks and winter to clear the sight of the fleeing lords. The news of their self-annihilation found them in poor spirits, as you might imagine, and made their empty stomachs feel all the more shriveled. In a rage of infuriated desperation, they invoked all the powers they could name and poured their armies back into the waiting maw of those familiar streets. They imagined themselves to be a cleansing storm, sweeping away their mistake in a squall of iron and blood. But to Arrakkamani, they looked as malnourished and beaten as their months of wandering the desert warranted. Yet he was not so bold as to overlook them, for even the blood of a corpse can still boil under the midday sun. His soldiers drew their lines and readied their weapons, hurling a mix of spears, arrows and insults at the ashamed returnees. They still came on, but to little avail. Their war elephants, the walking statement of their purloined wealth, crashed upon stakes and reeled at the spears of seasoned hunters. Their terror and demise was shared by the men at their feet, albeit slower, with a greater creep of dread and a more complete experience of the betrayal their lords had orchestrated against them all. By day's end, no fewer banners of Medewi flew over Axum. By week's end, trade in elephant's hide had paid for the damage done. And by year's end, Arrakkamani was gone, returning to his path, the path north, astride the Nile, the jagged, vile and steep path to glory. To the northeast of Medewi was a small port, standing out from the other ports of the African coast in that it had established a small town about itself, being fortunately situated on a patch of fertile land. This port, Ptolemaios Theron, was at that time playing host to a group of settled desert nomads, the Ptolemaioi. They were not unlike the people who had once settled a fertile piece of desert and founded the city in which Arrakkamani was born. They had been friends of Medewi, and while withdrawn at that current point in time, the good king had no desire to engage them. Quite the contrary, in fact, for you would not find an ally more eager to fight the Ptolemaic Empire, rulers of Upper Egypt and holders of the land Arrakkamani coveted, than the people of Ptolemaios Theron. As the town's name would suggest, these Ptolemaioi were living off land apportioned to some noble house of the Northern Empire, and that Northern Empire wanted the land that bore its very name to be returned. The king then gathered gifts and gold from across his territories, calmly slaughtering any who opposed such measures. He marched out with rotting enemies behind and budding friendships ahead. But such was his generosity that his men were overburdened with offerings, and such was the desert heat that the exertion of moving it dragged his parade ever towards shade and rest. Such toil can only have reflected the sincerity of his mission, and yet it was self-defeating. For the Ptolemaic Empire had moved quickly and struck down the vast army of the Ptolemaioi like a lamb for the slaughter. No prisoners were taken, and the bodies were left to cook on the sand where they fell. The people of the town would be next, and now nothing stood between them and the huge and hungry empire. They called out to Arrakkamani's approaching force to save them. He did not hesitate to place the Ptolemaioi people under his protection and declare them to be citizens of Medewi. To mess with them meant to mess with him, and thus the Ptolemaic army faded back into the desert haze without a word. They had been saved. The people of Ptolemaios Theron gathered all they could to offer to Arrakkamani as parting gifts. But he was not planning on returning home, and nor was he bluffing about the people now being citizens of Medewi. The measure that had saved them would now be permanent, and they had no men under arms to argue otherwise. The lords of Ptolemaioi were expectedly furious with the acts of their southern neighbour, but in turn had no desire to deal with the distant and impoverished desert people when they were in a position to conquer the great and wealthy empires of the Mediterranean. So they made a simple offer to Arrakkamani: give them access to the eastern trading ports, and no more would be said of the matter. The king asked for 1 year to collect the tribute required to show his respect for their offer. The Egyptians were delighted to imagine the difficulty their lesser neighbours must have in collecting coins from their disparate, uncultured peoples, and waited with amusement for the king's eventual begging excuses. The next thing they heard of it was a bloodied rider from the market town of Diospolis, talking of painted warriors raiding and conquering at the back of a figure in golden armour. After some debate, it was decided that the reports could not all be madness, and that an army be dispatched to investigate the matter. Marching hastily via rarely trodden desert routes, they made their way south, baking in their thick chest plates. It would be an arduous march to reach Diospolis before the Medewi raiders had entrenched themselves beyond removal. If only they had known that mere days before they reached the high road south, Arrakkamani and his whole army had been there, marching in the opposite direction. With ambitious speed, the king had slipped past his foe, routing a portion of the Ptolemaic army scheduled to meet with their main force beside the Nile. As Arrakkamani and his men broke apart the city garrison at Memphis and cast out the Hellenic elites, the army those elites had confidently paid to deal with the far-away Medewi was fording the Nile just days from their final destination. There they indeed saw an army of the south, far less formidable looking than reports had described. For Arrakkamani had predicted that events would unfold as they did, and tasked one of his court rivals, Ozalkes, with holding Diospolis. If he failed, the king would lose a promising rival, and if he succeeded, he would secure supply lines all the way up the Nile and bring the dream of a new Kushite pharaoh that much closer to reality. It is not impossible to think that the former was his preference, for indeed the supplies acquired from Memphis would last his army long enough for many years of war, and indeed the men he had spared for Ozalkes were but a few hundred in number, and without the skill to stop the well-drilled Ptolemaic expedition. But Ozulkis had seen through such a trap the moment the command had arrived. Being one of Medewi's rich elites, made even more financially buoyant by the gold of Axum, he could buy a chance for survival. He had paid nearly every mercenary from Medewi to Diospolis to join his army, and so on the day of the battle led a force of Egyptians, Greeks and Celts at the head of a hastily assembled militia to meet his foe on the banks of the Nile. They arrived to the site of tightly ordered ranks of armoured troops already splashing their way across the river. With metal shields and long pikes, they seemed to shrug off the arrows rained down upon them and sweep back warriors sent to check their advance. It seemed like the Medewi force, while larger than the invader, would be scattered like leaves on the wind. And perhaps it would have been, were it not for the sight of their commander Ozulkis rushing down the hill to the enemy's rear, leading his retinue of lesser Medewi noblemen on a mad charge into the crowds of Ptolemaic light infantry and camp followers still waiting to cross the river. The panic they brewed spread quickly forwards to the attacking troops, now forced to watch over their shoulders just as the Diospolis militia began its attack. Another storm of arrows and javelins that sounded a deadly rattle as they fell onto the mass of heavily laden pikemen. Their ranks began to thin, while behind them they could no longer see the rest of their army, only the banner of Ozulkis as he waded his horsemen across the river, killing all he met. The fear of the sight struck with such ferocity that many of the trained warriors broke from their ranks and jumped back into the river, desperate to escape before the trap was closed. For most, it was too late. Fear begat fear, and within moments the whole elite core of the Ptolemaic force found itself racing backwards, pursued by crowds of loot-hungry mercenaries, hunters and tribespeople. Too exhausted to traverse the quick ford, the pride of the Ptolemaic Empire, the mighty Phalangite companies, were slaughtered, their blood washing north downriver with a cargo of helmets, shields and pale-skinned limbs floating on the surface. Arrakkamani and the anxious people of Memphis and Alexandria needed no clearer message about what had happened on that faraway battlefield, and no clearer vision of what was still to come.